Hello, this is Cate Stillman. Welcome back to the Yogahealer Real Life Show. This month, we're going into Ayurveda and the nuts and bolts of basic Ayurvedic theory. And my hope is that for those who have studied a bit of Ayurveda, that it brings you deeper into your knowledge. And for those who are just dabbling in Ayurveda or maybe have never even heard of Ayurveda, that you get a fair introduction this month. I've been podcasting here at Yogahealer since 2012. We have hundreds of episodes. We have millions of downloads. And I've never done this intro series on Ayurveda, fascinatingly enough. The last episode I did was on what is Ayurveda. So if you're kind of wondering about what is Ayurveda, I would listen to that. In this series, we will do a history of Ayurveda with to be announced, who exactly is our historian expert. We have some great ones in the lineup. In the next few episodes, including this one, I'm going to go into the doshas, this 3 dosha theory. What is Vata? What is Pitta? What is Kapha dosha? What is the dosha? What is Vata constitution? And what are Vata imbalances is what we're going to cover in this show today. In the next one, we'll do the same thing with Pitta and the following with Kapha. So as we begin, I want to preface this with why it can seem that Ayurveda is challenging to learn. It's hard to learn. When we look at the history of healing and the history of medicine, from a Western mindset, and most of my listeners are not born and raised in India. I'm not preaching to the choir, right? I'm preaching to those of us who have perhaps been dismayed or disappointed with Western medicine, right? For those of us who may have also been totally impressed and blown away, and in Western medicine may have saved our lives, but might not have been able to connect us more deeply with our own intuitive self-healing powers. And when we look at the history of Western medicine, what we can see is that the healing, intuitive, self-care aspects were destroyed over the last 2,000 years. And so this massive resurgence that we're currently experiencing, primarily women-driven, Western women-driven in self-care, in understanding East meets West medicine. This is part of where Ayurveda has become much more interesting to those of us in the West. And Ayurveda has its own fascinating and war-torn history in this preservation of this ancient wisdom tradition and the innovations in this tradition over time. So we'll talk about more of that in the history of Ayurveda. But today, as we go into what are the doshas and we look at what are these forces of the elements? What are these forces of wind? What is the forces of fire, the forces of water? And why are we so disconnected from nature? Why are we so disconnected from our own cells, from our own understanding of what our bodies are trying to communicate with us? And how do we restore that deep, intuitive, self-healing ability that we're all born with? And this to me is where Ayurveda, the language, as soon as we translate it into words that we're more familiar with in English, and they become more accessible, and then later as we maybe learn them in Sanskrit and they become more powerful, that this is all part of our healing process. One of my favorite books that describes the history of healing from a Western perspective is Woman as Healer, this book by Jean Achterberg is super, super powerful, a panoramic survey of the healing activities of women from prehistoric times to the present. In reading this book, one of the things that really stood out to me, especially in relationship to this What is Ayurveda series, is that in the West, our intuitive knowledge of healing was systematically destroyed by the patriarchy, by Western allopathic and scientific thought. And so a lot of what we're doing right now, those of you who are with me on this journey listening to the series, is we're repairing the damage within our own psyches. We're reconnecting the dots of understanding that we are the cosmos, that within each of us listening, that we have the cosmic intelligence, that we know the universal laws. We're reconnecting the dots. So this question of what is Vatadosha, what is the Vata constitution, what are Vata imbalances? If we look at this from if we look at this from just nature as such, what we're really talking about here is what is the wind? What is the force of wind in our bodies? What is the force of air moving through ether, of expansion across time and space? What is this concept within our bodies? So the word Vata, V-A-H, Va, is a verb, and it means vehicle or to carry or to move. So any movement in the body, any principle of mobility, anything moving within the body or within the mind or within the intuitive body, anything that is moving, including the movement of thoughts, the movement of emotions, the movement of feces, the movement of breath, the movement of swallowing and digesting your food, the movement of nutrients into cells, the movement within cells, all of this is Vata. The movement of urine out of the body, feces out of the body, menses out of the body, sweat out of the body, tears out of the body, burps, farts. It's not. Any movement is under the domain of Vata. That is the force that is causing the movement, is Vata. So when we look at constitutionally, like what is someone who has more Vata, more of this force of wind, right, and less of the force of fire and less of the force of water, this person is going to have a lot more movement within them. And the thing about movement, if you go ahead and just rub your hands together, right, you'll notice that when you rub your hands together that you have movement, and then you have friction. There's heat generated. That's the force of fire. And you might even notice more moisture in your palms than when you started. And that is the force of kapha, or of the moisturizing, the moisture element. So those who have more Vata, in relationship to, because the doshas are always in relationship to each other. If you have more Vata in relationship to Pitta or Kapha, there's going to be a lot more movement of thought. There's going to be much more movement or transparency of emotions. And there's going to be just a lot more tendency of moving within the physical body. Hard to sit still. So the attributes of the wind, just think of the wind. Right? That it's dry. If you're out on a windy day, it's dry. It's not like being out in humidity that's stagnant, right? This is the wind. It's dry, and that is its primary characteristic. It's dry. It's also light. Compared to fire and compared to water or earth, there's a lightness to the wind. It's cold. Think of outer space expanding. Think of how as soon as you leave the Earth's atmosphere, as soon as you leave the solar system, as soon as you get into space, and that is one of the key elements of Vata, right? You have movement and you have space. You have wind moving through space, as space is cold, really cold. So Vatas will tend to be dry and light and cold. They'll tend to experience these qualities, and I'll get into how they experience these qualities in just a moment. The other attributes is dryness will create a roughness. And you can think of roughness in terms of personality. Some people have a less than teddy bear, fuzzy, cozy personality. People can have roughness in their skin. These are ways that we might see the quality of rough. Vata is also subtle. Even when you start thinking about how huge this universe you live in actually is, right? The galaxies among galaxies among galaxies among galaxies. How huge it is. Your awareness becomes much more subtle, much less mundane or earthy than the tree planted outside of your house. The other characteristics is moving. We already covered that. And that it's clear. There's a clarity that you can see, with a transparency. It's not cloudy. Vata isn't cloudy. It's very clear. So often Vata in the personality types where you have these subtle and clear and light and mobile attributes is the person's mind can instantaneously understand something. They can pull in outlier ideas. Vata constitutional types are often very curious. They're very enthusiastic. They have a lot of like quick start energy, quick to get things going energy. Less so on the follow through, right? They're less of the endurance mule that the Kapha counterparts are. So this ability to perceive in a way that is subtle, in a way that is outside of normal, right? Almost goes into paranormal. These super extra sensitive, super extra sensory human beings among us that are Vatas. They have in so many ways these incredible innate superpowers that are all about being like a super sensitive instrument. And what can be so hard about being a Vata, about having Vata predominance in your constitution, is that the modern world is hyper stimulated. We have hyper mobility of the mind happening, where like you pick up your phone, and I remember when I first got my phone, I was like, I wonder about all these apps. I'd look at like one of my, in the world of business, I'd look at like some of my friends' phones, and they have like 50 apps on their phone. And I'd have like 10. This was years and years ago. Now I have like 50 apps on my phone, and I use a lot of them. Like the amount of like hyper stimulation out there. Like you go on any social media channel and it's just hyper stimulation, and stimulation is mobility, right? And so for those of us who are, those of you who are Vata, I can't say us because I'm not predominantly Vata, in your constitution, in your prakruti, like we talked about in the What is Ayurveda episode, in your innate constitution, one of the keys for balance, one of the keys for you to thrive is to really actually limit stimulation. For you, it's even more important than for your Pitta and Kapha counterparts. Because modern life is so irregular, is so arrhythmic, right? Akrama is what the word we might use in Sanskrit is. It's against the nature of rhythm. People are eating later at night. They're staying up later. Netflix says its biggest competitor is sleep. And I've gotten caught in that trap once or twice myself, where like, oh my gosh, all these attention, addiction, things that are happening in the world of media, like this is the real deal. And for a Vata who's so sensitive, who's so light, can get pulled in by the gravity of an addictive app, can get pulled in by the gravity of an addictive channel like social media, or pulled into the gravity of cultural habits that don't support their ultra sensitive technology. And when that happens, the thing about Vata is because it's so light and it's so subtle, it's quicker to break. It's quicker to break down. Their immune systems are quicker to break down. So the keys to balancing Vata have everything to do with limiting stimulation, with krama, with regularity. Now, the Body Thrive habits are key for this. And if you haven't read the book, read the book, do the habits. And if it's hard, join the course, right? We'll make it easy. Now, these habits are the habits of deep rhythm. They're the habits that build resilience. Vatas need regularity. The deal with the characteristic of mobility, right? Vatas are constantly moving, is that it's really easy to become irregular. But having the regular basic habits, really the boring habits, right? The ones that seem less exciting to Vatas, those are the crucial habits for Vatas to have. And that is the paradox. Every doshic type I talk about with Vata, Pitta, Kapha, I promise I'll talk about the paradoxes. And the paradoxes is what make balance hard, challenging, right? This is how we get off track really easily. So for a Vata to, when they actually start to live a more, and I will use the word boring, like a much more structured, a much more rhythmic lifestyle, eating at the same time every day during daylight hours so that their digestive fire gets stable and gets strong, doing self-care practices at the same time every day, going to bed at the same time every night, and before 10 p.m., things that are almost impossible for most Vatas in the modern age, right? Where it just seems like no can do. But when a Vata starts to adopt these habits, what happens is resilience. And when you have resilience, you can take much more interesting, much more exciting risks than if you're always depleted, always overwhelmed, always hyperstimulated. And that is the payoff. That is the key. So in terms of the physical qualities, I'll just go through some of the physical qualities of Vata, like how does Vata appear in the body, and then how does Vata appear in the mind. And I'll read a little bit from Textbook of Ayurveda, A Complete Guide to Clinical Assessment by Dr. Vasant Lad. So Vatas tend to have a slimmer body frame, a lighter body weight. They tend to be thin, angular. They can actually, their like eyes and their cheeks can be a little bit more sunken. So you see a lot more bone definition in their faces. Their eyes can tend to be much smaller, whereas Kapha eyes are really quite big. Their nose can have an uneven shape. Often their face can have a very interesting look to them. When someone's face just looks like very interesting, maybe asymmetrical, that's a characteristic of Vata. Their skin tends to be thinner, drier, cooler, and darker. They tend not to be the ones that get a sunburn that easily. Their hair is often thin, as opposed to thick. It's often dry. Sometimes it's brittle or curly. It takes up a lot of space. Their necks can be thin and long. Their chests are usually flat. So for women, Vata types, usually very small breasts. Their belly can also be quite thin or flat or even sunken inwards. Their belly buttons tend to be small. Their hips tend to be slender. This is where like all those skinny jeans they really go great on Vata types and are easier to wear for Vata types because of those, non-super curvy, Venus type look of the body. It's much more thin, slender, much more of a rectangular shape between the shoulders and the hips as opposed to triangular or curvy. And their joints tend to crack a lot, and they're often their body temperature, they feel cold. Really, even like regardless of the season, they're the ones what will always need to bring an extra sweater or jacket. Their appetites tend to be irregular. And they don't have a strong appetite in general. They can't usually eat a lot of food at a sitting. Digestively, they tend to have irregular appetite, irregular elimination. So constipation can definitely be an issue. Gas and bloating are usually an issue for Vata types. Elimination towards constipation. Physical activity, they'll tend to be hyperactive, but they tend to also have really poor endurance, like I talked about before. So they might be like, oh yeah, I want to go climb the mountain. But then, like 3 miles in, they're like, oh boy, they're starting to crash. So for them to build resilience is really a key. Emotionally, they tend towards anxiety and fear and uncertainty and overwhelm. And this really comes from when I've worked with Vatas over time, this sense of not being supported and not being enough is really the crucial path. Like this is to me the spiritual path of Vata, which part of the paradox is the fear with rhythm, with the habits of rhythm, with eating at the same time, eliminating at the same time your poop every day, hydrating systematically, sleeping systematically. As that happens, what happens is faith. You start to cultivate a faith in the cosmos that created you. You create a faith in your body, that your body doesn't just have random symptoms. You actually figure it out. You're like, oh, if I do these things, I get to experience strong appetite. I get to experience strong digestion, what's called Sama Agni. I get to experience deeper sleep. I get to experience regular elimination. I get to experience deepening my resilience and endurance. So faith is also part of the paradox for Vata. They tend towards fear. Their spiritual path is to cultivate faith, not through just like positive thinking faith, but through aligned daily self-care actions that are the specific ones I just talked about. Their intellect tends to be really quick, like quick to learn, but unfortunately quick to forget, right? So they have to build a container for deeper learning. They have to use repetition for deeper learning. In general, their recollection in the recent past is good. In the distant past is poor. Their dreams tend to be quick and active. Their sleep tends to be less scanty, broken up, often tossing and turning. It can be quite an issue for Vata. Their speech tends to be rapid, sometimes unclear, and financially, they tend to be able to make money quickly, but then because of this mobility, they'll also spend money quickly. And that's definitely part of the lessons for Vata, which is the lesson of instead of letting energy dissipate, can we reverse that and start to focus on accumulate? And when a Vata can get this, when they actually start to be very protective of themselves, protective of their habits, protective of who they spend time with, protective of their finances, they thrive, right? And they're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I'm no longer forgetting my keys. I'm no longer taking on too many projects and not bringing them to completion. I'm no longer afraid, right? Instead, I'm developing a much deeper digestive fire. I'm developing the calmness and the soothingness of water, the rootedness of earth. So it's interesting if you are a Vata type, right, and you're noticing that you're dissipating energy. Perhaps you have too many projects going on. You've got too much in the world of you, and you really need to cut that. You really need to cut that back. I recommend the 80-20 rule. I did a podcast on this on the Yoga Health Coaching show last month called Navigating Stress and Ambition for Wellness Pros. I recommend going back to that because I really get into how do you cut out all the distractions and build the capacity to focus on that which is most important. That is very hard for Vata types because it requires fire element, and Vatas naturally blow their fire element out. It's like when a wind comes into a campfire and it actually starts to disperse the fire. And the campfire has a harder time getting into deep traction, deep coals, deep white coals, right? What we want to do is actually build the deeper heat, those white burning coals. And that happens through this conscious choosing, and it's building a habit of consciously choosing. If you only have a limited amount of energy, where does that energy go so that it builds more heat, so that it builds more structure in your life to thrive? So when Vata has just complete freedom and complete spontaneity, which is its nature, it's outer space expanding into the unknown, when it has that unbridled, it loses its capacity to manage in the world. And that really is the biggest issue for most modern day Vatas, is that life in the modern world is very challenging, right? There's a lot of draws on your attention. There's a lot of opportunities. There's too much to do. The endless to-do list, it can't all get done. And you are limited. You're limited in your energy. You're limited in your ability to transform food into bodily tissue and daily energy. So what you want to do is cultivate the fire, cultivate the earth or the structure in your life. So a few other things people are searching for when they're asking what is Vata dosha, a bit on what are the symptoms of Vata dosha. The biggest symptoms in the digestive tract are bloating or gas, burping, and constipation or bowel irregularity. Those are the big ones. Vatas have a hard time digesting their food because their digestive fire or Agni is not very strong. Other symptoms of Vata are the sleep issues that we already talked about. Other symptoms are arthritis. And a lot of this comes from, because Vata types aren't digesting their food well, level of undigestion or undigested food or ama, or that which has not yet been completely digested, that energy builds up in the colon. the minerals are pulled from the colon into the bones. And so with the minerals, basically the ama is pulled, and it's an issue for vatas with bone strength and just not very good, strong nourishment of the bone tissue. So osteoarthritis is a huge issue for people later in life. Forgetting things, basically being in chronic stress, right, due to financial instability. These are all symptoms of Vata. The cure for it, I already went through. It's rhythm. It's really basic, right? It's really unsexy. It's really not very exciting, but boy, does it work. And it makes life so much more exciting. All right, what foods should Vata avoid? It's interesting that the qualities of foods for Vata that, and again, I look at qualities of foods. Everyone should be eating seasonally, eating locally, eating seasonally, because nature will provide the solutions with seasonal eating. So if we look then to the next level in, the qualities of food for Vata should be opposite of the qualities of Vata. So if Vata is primarily dry, the foods Vatas eat should be primarily moist. If the quality of Vata is cold, then the food should be warm, right? If it's rough, the food should be smooth or liquidy or soupy or unctuous, oily. So it's having this perspective is really super helpful. Whereas like Kaphas need foods that are more subtle, like lots of raw foods and leafy greens and sprouts and those quick energies foods. Vatas need more like cooked soups and stews, one pot meals where everything is combined before it hits the digestive tract. One of my favorite tonics for Vatas is gut shots, which is basically like sauerkraut juice, where you make, I just ferment cabbage, salt, water. Sometimes I'll add some beets, some ginger, and I'll just basically blend up a big blender full of this with water and let it then sit for a few days, stirring it a few times a day. And it'll ferment in about 3 days. Run it through a strainer, and now I have this fermented digestive tonic. It's just basically fermented cabbage juice. The beets and the ginger are phenomenal for warming digestion. For Vata types, beets are heating, ginger's heating. And so for Vata types to take a digestive stimulant before eating food is really smart. For them to choose warm, soupy, oily, substantial foods is much better than raw salads or crunchy protein bars, that sort of thing. Another one of my favorite foods for Vata is in the morning and I'll do this all the time, where I'll take about 4 tablespoons of chia seeds and mix it into a quart of water and keep that in the fridge. And then each morning upon arising, taking a big tablespoon of those moisturized chia seeds and adding some hot water and adding some either those gut shots or a little bit of liquid chlorophyll or a little bit of ginger juice. And then just sipping that 2 cups of that hot water mixed with a little of the chia and the other stuff to just allow elimination, that it soothes the digestive tract and it starts to promote elimination. Some of the larger Vata types out there, anyone who's weighs 150 pounds or more, men, you can do 2 of those. So you're drinking up to a quart of warm, unctuous water first thing in the morning. And those little tips help so much. So how can you reduce Vata immediately? Really one of the keys is warm spices. So if you're just I'm all bloated and I'm constipated, simply chewing on toasted fennel seeds. It's another very simple solution for Vata types. But when your Vata is out of balance a lot, what you got to ask yourself is why? Where am I out of rhythm? Where am I taking too much on? Where am I living against the natural cycle? So the wind can be behind your back. And when the wind's behind your back, it means you're living in sync with the circadian rhythm. You're going to bed early, you're waking up early, you're eating at 3 regular times a day. You're not snacking between meals. You're sipping hot water. You're being hydrated. You're moving regularly throughout the day. When you're doing that, Vata doesn't build up. But when you're off, that's when you're gonna it's when you're gonna get bloated. It's when you're gonna get overwhelmed. And one of the simplest solutions for that, and I have a tip sheet, and it's in the show notes here. So go to yogahealer.com and click on this Click on the show and you'll get a link to how to thrive as a Vata, and all of these tips are right in there. But back to the fennel seeds with bloating. This is the last thing I'm going to mention is you can just take a cup of fennel seeds. You can buy them at the health food store, dry roast them in a cast iron skillet for a few minutes until they turn light brown, roast them on low, and then store them, let them cool, and then store them in a glass jar. Then throughout the day, actually, you can even just like chew on a few fennel seeds. They're best taken before or after a meal. And what fennel does is it helps drop wind down. Now, wind tends to go up and it tends to expand outward. So what you're doing is you're saying to the force of movement, you're saying movement, go down. And then it'll push the gas out. You might notice you'll fart a much. You might notice the bloating goes away as you're able to move that trapped air down and out. And that's a very quick way to reduce Vata immediately. Another one of my favorite ways is to get in the habit of self-massage. That's habit number 6 in the book Body Thrive and in our course Body Thrive, where you simply take time each day to rub oil on your skin. I often do it after a hot shower. I'll then rub a few ounces of oil into my skin, and that soothes that rough, mobile quality of Vata. It helps you feel like everything's okay. You're okay. You've got this. Your body makes sense, and it puts you back in that driver's seat. All right, so I hope after listening to this, you have a better idea of what is Vatadosha, what is the Vata constitution, and what Vata looks like out of balance, with a few tips to get yourself back in balance. Namaste. Again, this has been Cate Stillman with Yogahealer.com.